Welcome back, everyone, to the Disaster Tough podcast, where we share insights into the big plays and right calls of leadership. We dive deep into the stories, lessons learned, and ideas that will help you in the field. Let's go. Welcome back to the Disaster Tough podcast. I'm your host, John Scardina. I am so excited for this week's episode. Every week, I have a great opportunity to meet very cool, very different people from all walks of life and perspectives. We've had, I don't know, at this point, we've kind of had everybody on the show from different worlds, from the public sector to the private sector, military, emergency managers, first responders. I also like finding cool things. If you've been following EM Weekly with Zach Boris, he also liked looking at cool tech. And we found a really cool company, Forerunner. I have a very, very special opportunity to interview both of the founders today. So you get to hear from their story, their perspective. But it's all about responding to, preparing for the whole deal in emergency management, that disaster life cycle perspective, and expanding how our field operates. We need to get to the next level. I've talked about this so many times on the podcast. Absolutely, it's time to take our field to the next level. One of the ways to do that is technology. And so we try to find cool companies that we like. So we've asked them to come onto the show and talk about their perspectives and their stories. So with that, I'm going to have Susanna and JT join me on the show. Welcome, guys, to Disaster Tough.
So good to join you.
That's good. I'm glad you're happy about that. That's a good thing. So
it's 7 a.m. in the morning here, so bright and early.
Bright and early, you're living the dream. In the disaster management world, specifically emergency management, they always said it's a morning job, and I am not a morning person at all. I would take the night shift every single time. So good on you for 7 a.m. Joining us bright and early. And then JT, you're in Maine. You're on the opposite side of the country, right?
Yeah, that's right. Very excited to be here, though.
If you're not awake by now, it's I have a Monster or I have a Red Bull somewhere around here. So let's talk about you guys. You're the founders of the company. You live on opposite sides of the country. How did you guys meet? Where did the concept of Forerunner come from?
It's a great question. I guess I'll pick this one up. So Susanna and I met when we were just in school at the MIT Media Lab, which is like a research institution at MIT, and we both worked at this group called Changing Places, where basically it was looking at how technology can be applied to sort of the urban fabric. And we worked on this crazy project where we were building cities out of Legos, and then we were like projecting data onto these sort of like cities built out of Legos. And in some ways, what we do at Forerunner is not too different to the aims of that particular project. But yeah, we met there, became really close friends, and then I guess it was like 8 or 9 years later, decided that we wanted to build a company together and started Forerunner.
So I'm gonna call out one of my favorite people, Ashley Loria Golden. She and I went to Georgetown together. And I was responding to tornadoes in Georgia in 2016 or 17. I think it was 17. And it was a really rough day. And unfortunately, a 4-year-old boy died when he shouldn't have died because of building codes and all this other stuff. And she lived in Georgia, and she was an old classmate of mine. And I called her that day. And I said, I'm starting a company. I'm fixing this freaking problem. And so it's cool that, that similar mindset, right? And so she joined me for the first 3 years here and just really helped out. And then she became a mom, and her whole world took off in different directions. But it's cool to see that. I have so many people on the podcast. This is kind of a random tangent, but they question education. They wonder if education's beneficial for them, or if they need formal education in these different areas. But I always talk to them about the Ashley story, and your story is very similar. Not just the education, but the social aspect of education too. You started a company together. I mean, who could have known that 8 or 9 years before that, right? So that's pretty cool that you came up with that. In terms of the Lego concepts and throwing data on top of that, I'm a little confused by that. I'm sure the listeners are a little confused by that. You're doing the same thing now. I mean, it sounds cool. For us who do not have that MIT understanding, Susanna, can you kind of walk through what that means for us?
Yeah, so the Lego concept was fairly interesting. It was also very fun to do, you can kind of imagine. But what it was basically, I think there was a gap. We noticed that there was a gap in how people were sort of perceiving decisions made around physical space. And so the Lego model work was meant to help address that, right? And so Lego model is very tactile, very easy to interact with. People of all ages can interact with them. So it created an opportunity to say, okay, hey, let's say we're changing this thing about a city system. What's the actual impact on the city itself, right? And you could actually take those, move them, and understand what the impact of that was more broadly. I think the way that it sort of translates to what we do now is that we similarly encounter a lot of that kind of confusion when it comes to topics like flooding, right? It can be difficult to understand like the sort of real world implications of decisions around flooding, and a lot of what we do starts to shed light on that.
The L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapse and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at l3harris.com right now. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today. So when you're talking about moving buildings and moving infrastructure around decision making, are you talking about like everything from the critical infrastructure, like how the actual information flows throughout the city through pipes and systems? Or are you talking about how people utilize the city in terms of crowd control? What do you mean when you're talking about data and how it impacts the city when you're looking at that?
Yeah, so what Forerunner does more broadly is that we sort of pull together a bunch of disparate data sets. I think when we started the company, we found that a lot of the individuals that dealt with natural disasters just had data in a bunch of different places. It was really hard for them to pull it together into one place to, one, make decisions, and then two, inform their residents, and then three, sort of contemplate a better future, right? So how do we harness all this data that exists in a way that is productive for our residents in the near term? And so Forerunner has really sort of evolved to, one, enable decision making, but then also to enable the day-to-day of things like floodplain management and emergency management more broadly.
The reason why I like having CEOs or founders on the show is because you know that they've had to say that same thing 1,000 times, and so
Does it sound like I've said it a million
it sounds
times?
so clean. If you haven't said that before,
I
you
have
should
never
record
said
it.
that before.
Really, that's so funny. Yeah, that's hilarious. If you're ever in an elevator, that's literally like just copy and paste exactly what you said. That's a very easy way to understand it. For me in my world, it's very frustrating because I love data. I'm a data scientist by background, and yet when we're looking at rebuilding communities after disaster, one of the many issues that we have is trying to convince decision makers to spend money on new infrastructure that hasn't existed before in order to mitigate for future disasters. Like Build Back Same has been such a precedent that we're trying to change to Build Back Better. As a company who is looking at that, maybe either of you can address this. If you're specifically targeted, your mission is to make it better because you don't want the residents or you don't want those communities to be impacted in the future. How do you combat that as a private sector entity to the public sector? Let's just build it back to the same. How do you deal with that? Have you dealt with that yet, or where you at with that?
Yeah, maybe I can take the first stab at this and then Susanna can follow up. But maybe one example that sort of comes to mind is FEMA actually has some really great tools and regulations. If you're a community that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, you have to track substantial improvement and substantial damage, which basically says that if you have a structure, maybe it was built in the 60s before there are any flood maps available, and so that house was built slab on grade, but it's in a flood zone, and should probably maybe have not been built in the first place, or at least built so it's like elevated to sort of encompass 100-year flood risk. FEMA has these rules that state that if you sort of improved that structure over 50% or it's damaged over 50%, that the structure needs to be brought up to compliance. So, it needs to, if we're going to sort of reinvest money in that structure after it's been damaged, we want to make sure that that investment is a good one. And so let's, pull it above the 100-year flood elevation. Now, some communities actually go a little bit beyond that, and they say, rather than tracking that sort of damage on a one-time basis, or that the improvements on the structure on a one-time basis, let's think about adding the improvements and damages over like a 10-year window, so that it becomes a little bit sort of, or it's a higher regulatory standard, meaning that the homeowner can only do so much to the property before they have to sort of pull that property up to compliance and elevate it. You'd be surprised by how frequently communities want to do something like that, but they just don't have the right sort of tracking or implementation from a technology perspective to do this effectively internally. And so, one thing that we feel like we're building with Forerunner is just this tool that makes it very easy, if you want to put in place some of these higher regulatory standards, that the actual internal capacity and operationalizing some of these higher regulatory standards is no longer a barrier. It's just something that's very easy to do. The software just completely automates it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think just building on that, most of the people that we work with and that we encounter, particularly in government, really want to build back better, and they want to adopt the higher standards that JT is talking about. And then we really see ourselves as just sort of empowering their ability to do so, right? And so they often say, we can't do that because we can't implement, as JT sort of said, or we can't do that because we can't, on an ongoing basis, communicate this to our residents. And so we really see our work as just unblocking them from being able to do what they want to do.
Yeah, I guess and those great insights. When I look at the regulatory issue or the building code issue, um, I do want the building codes to improve. Absolutely. I mean, there's the easiest example is it's after the Joplin tornado disaster in Missouri, where I live. Lobbyists successfully got the state to not increase the building codes. And if you look at like Moore, Oklahoma, that had been hit multiple times, they eventually did up the building codes. Therefore, newer homes were safer against like EF3 tornadoes, whatever. And that's where I want to get to. One of the good things about technology is that I don't know really how else to say this. It makes people who push back against good ideas feel very stupid, like negligence, right? Like we want if you're listening to the show and you're like, well, why tech? Like we've always done it this way, blah blah blah. I'm in that mission mindset, but I haven't had those outcomes that we're talking about here. The positive outcomes, if we could get to it. Like if you have data that says, hey, everything is pointing to this problem. You just saw it in the real world. It's going to happen again because it's a natural occurrence. Let's see if we can deal with this. If you just talk about that, again, talking to the audience here, then you're not going to get anywhere. But if you can bring in somebody like Forerunner and talk about the data and look at the analytics and pull this together, you can finally say, hey, like here's the solution without saying it. The solution is presented to them on a screen or otherwise. And now it's like, oh, any other way, whatever way that might be, is a poor choice, right? Oh, see, poor choice is better than saying stupid. See, work through it. But for you guys, going through that mission mindset of figuring out gaps and understanding this. Again, I'm just going to go pull back a little bit here to the foundation of how you guys came together with this project. Was there something like what was the catalyst that you said, "Hey, we have to do this"? I mean, you didn't have the idea for 9 years, right? So, in that 9-year period, what changed for both of you? You said, "Okay, like this has to be a project that turns into a business."
I think part of it was that there wasn't this crazy big event that made us want to start the company. I think it was that as we started kind of pulling back the veil, is that the phrase? Pulling back the veil of sort of how do people tackle flood risk more broadly in the U.S., right? And having conversations with floodplain managers, emergency managers, I think we found that a lot of the things that block them from making huge changes and doing really amazing things were super small, very easy to fix with technology problems, right? So an example would be most of our work happens pen and paper. And so we can't actually do something more creative because it's so hard for us to collect data with pen and paper already. And so taking a look at that, you're like, oh, we could address that so easily. And then there are all these sort of similarly little problems or little issues that our partners deal with on an ongoing basis. And when you pull those all together, we found that our software can really sort of make a meaningful difference in the day-to-day work of our partners. And so I think that's an interesting thing about what we do is that, there wasn't this huge catalyst, like there was this big storm and we were like, we have to do something about that. We just saw all of these little pain points and we were like, we can do something about that.
Yeah, we've kept it pretty high level. So let's go real tactical, real fast, because you're talking about like the data and you're talking about Forerunner specifically. JT, what is the technology? If you're going to explain the technology, I don't know if you could do it as good as Susanna just did like 10 seconds ago with that elevator pitch. But if you're able to just walk through, said, hey, if I had to visually or auditorily explain this to somebody, how would I do that? Like, what is the product?
Yeah, I probably won't do as good a job as Susanna does.
So I should have said that. I believe in you.
It's not a competition, you guys.
You both are all stars in my book.
It's a partnership. We're partners.
Yeah, so Forerunner is a geospatial platform, and you can kind of think about it in sort of two components. The first is we have a really great sort of geospatial map where you can pull together all of your data. And so for like floodplain management, that's normally all of the, FEMA's national flood hazard layers. And, if you have a preliminary or effective firm, you're pulling that into the dashboard. We automatically update it. We do the same for all of the parcel data. So it's a really sort of great user experience around this geospatial application. And then on top of that, we build out all of the workflows. So that's everything from, tracking substantial improvement, substantial damage, doing inspections on properties, tracking interactions with residents, managing all of the files and documents, and then being able to sort of like cut and slice that data in whatever way that our community partners want to access it. And it's very flexible. So somebody, the truth is that every community has different data needs and different workflow needs. And so the platform can be sort of tweaked so you can pull in whatever geospatial data you want and you can build whatever sort of workflows you want off of it. But at the end of the day, it really serves as this like one-stop shop for all of the data and all of the workflow. And then also it makes it very easy to push to the public. We have like a separate public application. So our community partners can sort of figure out what data they want to share publicly and then enable access to it.
And for the sake of people who are listening to, basically, when you're talking about platform, you're talking about a mapping visualization that can aggregate all your information for your incident, an incident management tool that is primarily based off of a geospatial and or a mapping capability, right?
Yeah. And then the one other big component too is that we have a great mobile application. So people use Forerunner out in the field. They're doing damage assessments using our mobile apps. We have offline mode. So in the case where there's no service or the network's down, they can still do those sort of critical workflows going out and surveying damage.
Can I just say, I'm going to pick on you a little bit, but I'm going to pick on all technology companies real quick. Okay. Every technology company, every time they talk to an emergency manager, every single time, they always make sure to tell us, hey, there's an offline mode. If your service doesn't have an offline mode and you're in disasters, you're dead to me. So the fact that you guys have that, great feature, but if you didn't have it, I don't endorse you. You suck. So thank goodness that you guys have that feature.
Is that the first question you ask?
Like, yeah. But
do you have offline mode?
Yeah. But like the reality is like a lot of emergency managers have service, right? And it has to be really austere conditions. I remember on the IMAT team, we would always practice austere conditions, and it would be like the most catastrophic scenario you could imagine. Meanwhile, like 90% of the disasters I got deployed at, like I was slumming it in like a 4-star hotel. And so I really give a big hat, or shout out to the USAR members, some of those first responders who are in austere conditions, even when other people are staying in hotels, and really the community members who are blasted, by those events. And so the fact that you guys have a public side where you're able to share, other people are not able to do that, and some more of the secure side where you're doing more of the incident management perspective, that's good for everybody. In terms of 2025, obviously we've had some conversations before this. We've been endorsing you guys now for a few months. We know that you guys are looking forward to even expanding into other areas. Some of those concepts you're talking about, already the FEMA tools that are out there, some of the data that's out there, you're starting to aggregate information. Essentially, the two of you are data analysts in a sense, right? And so the data is telling you to move Forerunner and or the technology into new areas in the future. Just for the sake of our audience who may want to start learning more about you guys and paying you guys in the future, what are some of the projects that you're working on? Maybe I can start with JT and then go to Susanna.
So I'll highlight one thing that we built this summer, which we're still continuing to sort of tweak and make better, which is, Forerunner always had in our sort of damage assessment module or bundle of features a preliminary damage assessment. So, when one of our community partners was impacted by a storm, they would go out and do these quick windshield assessments, just drive through quickly to understand where damage was occurring. And then after that workflow, they would have to go to a tool that was created by FEMA, and it's an incredible tool. It's called the Substantial Damage Estimator. And they would produce an estimate of the actual damage costs, and then that would become sort of the final determination. And we had a lot of requests from folks to actually build that functionality within Forerunner. And so now Forerunner makes it so that you can actually do a substantial damage estimate, meaning you input all of this sort of data on the property, and then put, the percentage damage on a bunch of elements of the property, and then it'll spit out an actual cost for the damages within the platform itself. And so you don't have to sort of jump between our tool and then FEMA's tool and then come back to Forerunner. It's just sort of all housed in Forerunner. And so unfortunately, we've had a lot of communities who have utilized that feature over the last couple weeks and months.
I appreciate how you said unfortunately, because it is unfortunate when they have to use it for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And we've gotten some great feedback. There's still some tweaks that we're making to it. We're also sort of, talking to folks at FEMA to ensure that tool is built correctly. And so we're tweaking it, but we're really excited to have that in the mix. It kind of felt like this big missing piece of the software. And now that we're able to produce those final damage estimates, I think our communities that we work with are getting a lot of value out of the tool.
Hey, we just want to do a quick pause X to thank all of our sponsors with the Readiness Lab Podcast Network, L3 Harris, Forerunner, C. Bernie World, HQE Systems, Ampapar Response Training Center, Impulse, Doberman Emergency Management, and especially all of you who subscribe to the TRL Insider program and who are listening to this episode right now. Thank you so much for your support. Let's jump back in. Sure. And then moving forward, Susanna, what are some of the new concepts that you guys are talking about?
Yeah, I think maybe building on what JT was talking about, one of the big benefits of streamlining some of that sort of data collection and data reporting is that it's easier to communicate to higher levels of government. So Forerunner, we work with cities and counties and also state agencies. And so in the near future, something that I'm excited about is that we're going to sort of enable better collaboration across those levels of government, a better data sharing across those levels of government, because we just think it's really important. We hear from our partners all the time that it's really important for them to sort of have a source of truth that they can rely on as we're kind of handing off information across different scales of government. And then the other thing that I'll highlight is that I'm really excited about is that for a lot of our partner communities, they don't just face one hazard, right? So we've talked a lot about flooding, but for most of them, there's compounded hazards. I'm from California, where we have a ton of different compounded hazards. I woke up last night in the middle of the night because there was an earthquake, for example. And so, and for a lot of our partners, they're sort of there's a lot of interest in saying, okay, well, we use Forerunner for our single source of truth for flood information, and we use it across the board. But we would love to use it as a single source of truth for other hazards as well, so that everyone can go to sort of one place and get the information that they need. And so one of the things that we're doing in the new year is expanding to additional hazards there as well. So if anyone listening has a great use case, we would love to chat about that.
That's awesome. And quite frankly, the field needs to get better at learning about cascading impacts as well, not just like multi-hazard, but
Yeah, that's really right.
yeah, some of the easiest things, and if you're in California, I did wildfires in California. One of the easiest things I would ask, especially like undergrads in emergency management when I go to like those speaking events is, if you have a wildfire, what is the cascading impact of wildfires? And a lot of question marks, right? It's like you have rain, then mudslides, road impacts, critical infrastructure. You're talking about weeks, months, down the road. And it was just trying to get them to think like not just the immediate impact of everything that's happening in front of them, because there's a lot to overwhelm you, especially if you're doing with evacuations and hazmat issues and big plumes and all that stuff. But you also have to think maybe the wildfire burning in that direction doesn't really matter, except it does because in 8 months it's taking out Highway 1 or whatever, Highway 5. So it's interesting to think about those things. It would be a miss for our podcast to not talk about how your organization, as an organization, as leaders, are addressing problems. We've talked a lot about Forerunner, but I'm also as a company where most of my staff is all over the country. If you're talking about being flexible earlier, JT, and those kind of things, and Susanna, you're talking about moving into the future, California, Maine, your staff has to be everywhere. As leaders in your organization, how do you maintain momentum even when your staff is all over the place? Especially this can apply to all those who are deployed and have the people in the field while some have their EOC or otherwise. How do you maintain that momentum? Susanna, maybe I'll ask you first.
Yeah, I think part of it is, I think every single person in the company feels really lucky to be able to do what we do. Being able to empower our partner communities just feels really meaningful on an ongoing basis, and we get a ton of feedback from them that helps to reinforce that. And so if we think about, everyone's sort of sitting in their individual home office and they might not be sort of connected to each other, what they're all connected to is the mission of the company. And so I think that does a lot to sort of galvanize a sense of urgency with the team. We all care so much about our partners. And so we really, really want to make them proud. And we also really, really want to help unblock them, right, in some of the things that they're doing. And so I think that does really help. And I'm sure JT has another thing to add there.
What Susanna's not telling you is that she wakes up extremely early and basically works Eastern time hours. And so we're always chatting, and it's like 4:30 a.m. her time.
Yeah, that's brutal. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much for letting me do this at 9:00 my time, which is like 4 p.m. in your world, Susanna, apparently. So
big disclaimer that we don't actually require the whole company, like everyone that works on the West Coast, to wake up at 4 a.m. It's just a personal preference.
That's a good way to motivate people. Good job.
But we're very flexible on working hours as a result of the fact that we're across multiple time zones. But what were you going to say, JT?
Between a couple of us here, I've obviously met Megan and Wheezy. They're awesome. Zach, when he was at IAEM last week, or I guess when this comes out in a few weeks, he met some of your other staff. He's had a great conversation with them. In fact, it's very hard to impress Zach. Zach knows his stuff better than most people. This is why he's my number 2. And he said he was impressed with their knowledge base and what they presented. So that was a huge win for you guys. If Zach was like green light on supporting Forerunner, so that made me feel like, oh, I didn't. He's also my tech guy, so if he doesn't like something, it's like, oh no. So the fact that he liked it was huge. So you got a couple good wins for me and my team, especially when we were dealing with hurricanes. A lot of people deployed. We had to cancel a training. We had to move things around. That mission first mindset that you're talking about, Susanna, is huge. When you have that buy-in for that mission, it's fantastic. When you don't have the buy-in, for me, I've had to learn over years of if people are missing deadlines and for what reason. And it took me a long time to realize if somebody was not bought into the mission or they really just had real world things happening and I couldn't see them every day. JT, because we're just trying to do this back and forth thing here a little bit. When you're managing your staff's expectations and things are starting to become a miss, what is your process to help realign them or to move them out of the company into a role that would be better for them and it's somewhere else? That was a good way to say that, right? Yeah.
Move them out of.
Yeah. Here's another role that's good for you outside of the company. Yeah.
Forerunner is remote first. We do have a couple office locations where folks do work together in person, but I do think as a remote first company, you have to maybe set expectations a little bit more clearly, and then also have like really strong feedback mechanisms for ensuring that people are sort of hitting the goals that you're setting as an organization. Just because it's harder, if folks are in Wisconsin and Maine and California and Texas and everywhere, it just gets really challenging. So I do think there are a lot of advantages for having a remote culture, but there's also the downside of you having to be, I think, a little bit more transparent and setting expectations very, very clearly.
So Zach is in Vermont. Ashley is in Georgia, and I've had people everywhere else, but those two specifically, I've tried to get them to move to St. Louis. Out of the two of you, which one tries to get the other one to move to their state? Do you guys ever have that conversation? And is it a lose-lose? Where are we at with that conversation?
I think we've moved out of that phase, and so we don't
Oh,
do it to each other at all, really. Do you agree, JT?
I'm going to put a disclaimer here that I hope my wife isn't listening to this podcast, but I think Susanna and I are both afraid that we're both going to have to move back to New York City, where we started the company in the first place.
why would you
Yeah.
be nervous about that?
Our largest group of employees are in New York City, so it
Oh,
feels
that
like
would
the
make
center
sense.
of gravity for the organization.
Yeah, so that's a good thing. I'm just selfish. I'm like years into this, right? Like 2017 started, and I'm still like, "Hey, you want to move to Missouri?" And I've actually moved states. So wherever I go, I'm like, "Hey, maybe you should move here." And but Zach or otherwise, like, Missouri sucks. Move to freaking Vermont. I'm like, Vermont sucks. Screw you. But it's kind of this like fun play thing. So it's interesting how you're even in your own data. It's not either where either of you live, but New York. Um, Either way, we're wrapping up on time here. I want to give kind of that final pitch moment to both Susanna and you, JT. Susanna, if you can start us off. If somebody's brand new to you, where do they go if they're interested in data? If they have no idea what to expect next, where can they go to learn more about you?
Best place to learn more about us is our website. So our website is www.forerunner.com. It's hard to say in audio format,
I'm so glad you actually said that because I have
but
looked up
hopefully
your
you got
company and
that.
every time I have to like, wait, is it with Forerunner, Forerunner Industries, Forerunner.com? Why the with? Can you explain that I know this is totally off topic, but why the with?
JT chose it, so he should defend it.
JT, you better have a good reason for this.
Well, let me first say I've been trying to get Forerunner.com
Oh
for
yeah.
5 years, and I haven't been successful yet, but I will have that domain at some point in the future.
I've been trying. So the parent company Doberman that I'm CEO of, I've tried to get Doberman.com so many times, and it's like obviously it's a dog website, but they don't even use it. It drives me nuts. Like Forerunner, like that's a common name. Like whatever. Look, there's some reasons for that, I'm sure, but for me, I'm like, gosh dang it, like this website. Okay, but why the width? You haven't explained that yet. You have to justify yourself.
I think we like to imagine that our communities are more resilient with Forerunner, or they respond to disasters better with Forerunner, and then the domain was available. So
I know that Megan and Wheezy help you out on marketing. You should consult them in the future about the domain name if it's not just Forerunner. But either way, with Forerunner.com, check out you guys. The number one product that you either sell and or help out communities with, JT, is what? What is the name of that product?
it's our floodplain management platform, and so if you're an NFIP uh, floodplain administrator at a local community, or even at a state, the software really helps to automate all of the workflows that you have to do. But as Susanna mentioned, we're adding additional hazards, so it's really becoming an all hazards resilience platform.
That's awesome. All hazards resilience platform.com. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, super easy to say.
Yeah. How many? Okay, this is also other random question before we get out of here. How many websites? You don't have to name all the websites. How many websites do you own? Because I end up purchasing like 14 random websites that are like allhazardsmanagement.com, and it just forwards to Doberman. Did you do that? Did you buy just like a ton of random websites? I hate this world that I have to do that. I'm not gonna lie. But
I have learned my lesson there.
Please teach
me. After you have like 15 websites that you pay $20 every year for, and you think about how many years you've been paying for those.
Yes.
I cut down a couple years back. I think we only have 2 or 3 domains currently. We do own climate.dev. So if there's any developers who are into climate change, that's our way to grab them.
I think I have one that says emergencymanagement.us, and I had to specifically apply for that one, and I was like, that's a pretty good one. Yeah, it's zero hits. Zero hits.
Unexpected.
I tried to do the SEO, so maybe it's time to get rid of some of these ridiculous websites. Either way, guys, thank you so much for talking to me, for taking the time. I said at the beginning of the episode before you came on here, I say it again, emergency management and really the emergency services community needs to move forward towards technologies. We're grossly behind other industries. We have life-saving, life-sustaining missions that we have to take care of. And there's companies like Forerunner out there with Forerunner.com that can help them. Do you like how I threw that in there? Like that can help them out there. And so I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and choosing to endorse our podcast. That's a big deal for us. And also at the same time, like I said, Zach met you in person or met your team in person. I've looked at all your stuff. I've liked your teams that we work for so far. Good people, good mission, good product. Thank you again so much for talking to me.
Thank you as well.
Thanks, Don. This was awesome.
Good. I'm glad it was awesome for you. It was great for me. Okay, so everybody, if you got something out of this podcast, if you haven't heard of Forerunner before and you're like, oh, cool, John, the Disaster Tough podcast, and these awesome people just talked to me about a new product that I can look at, give us a 5-star rating and subscribe. Make sure that you show us that that lets us know if you appreciated that. If you have a question for JT and Susanna specifically, you can contact us at contact@thereadinesslab.com and forward on. Otherwise, put your comments on social media. Look up withforerunner.com. We'll put it in the show notes, of course. You can check it out there. And we'll see you at the next one. Peace.